The torches burned low in the corridors of the palace, casting flickering shadows against the stone walls. Amnon sat alone in his chamber, a goblet of wine in his hand, swirling the liquid as he stared into the dim light. The night was silent, but his thoughts were loud. Outside, Jerusalem slept, but inside these walls power was shifting like the sands in the desert wind. He was the firstborn son of King David, the heir to the throne, the one destined to rule over Israel. And yet, as he sat there, feeling the weight of the crown that had not yet been placed upon his head, there was an emptiness inside him. Amnon had grown up in privilege, surrounded by luxury, trained in battle, taught in wisdom. He had everything a prince could ask for: power, wealth, status. But something gnawed at him, something he could not name. He took another sip of wine, his jaw tightening. "My lord?" Amnon turned his head to see Jonadab standing at the entrance, his cousin and closest confidant. "You sit alone tonight," Jonadab noted, stepping inside. "Has the weight of the throne already settled upon your shoulders?" Amnon scoffed, setting his goblet down. "The throne is still my father's, and he does not look like a man who will be leaving it any time soon." Jonadab smirked. "No, but the future is already in motion, my prince. Everyone knows you are the chosen heir. When the time comes, Israel will bow to you. If they do not first bow to Absalom," Amnon muttered. Jonadab arched an eyebrow. "You fear your brother?" Amnon shook his head, but he did. Not because Absalom was stronger, nor because he was more skilled in battle, but because he had the people's hearts. "Fear? But I see the way they look at him. He is David's son, but he carries himself like a king already, and the people love him for it." Jonadab poured himself a drink, studying Amnon carefully. "Then let them love him. Love is fleeting, my prince. Power is what lasts, and power already belongs to you." Amnon exhaled, running a hand through his hair. It should have been enough, but it wasn't. Because even with his claim to the throne, even with all his riches, he wanted more, and he always had. Since he was a boy, he had taken whatever he desired, never once denied the pleasures of a prince. And yet, there was one thing that he could not have, one thing that tormented his every thought. "Jonadab," he said slowly, his voice lower now. Jonadab set his goblet down. "Yes?" "Tamar." Jonadab's expression remained neutral, but there was something knowing in his gaze. "Your sister." "My half-sister," Amnon corrected quickly. Jonadab tilted his head. "What about her?" Amnon clenched his fists. "She is unlike any other. She moves with grace, speaks with wisdom. She is the most beautiful woman in the kingdom, and yet she remains distant, untouchable." Jonadab leaned back, considering his words. "A dangerous longing," he said at last. "I have everything, Jonadab," Amnon said, his voice sharpening. "Everything. And yet she is beyond my reach. Do you know what that does to a man?" Jonadab smirked, sipping his wine. "Yes, it makes him desperate." Amnon's jaw tensed. "Then tell me, cousin," he said, his voice laced with frustration. "What would you do if you were me?" Jonadab set his goblet down, stepping closer. "I would find a way," he murmured. "A way?" Amnon repeated. Jonadab's smirk deepened. "A way to bring her to you, to have her in your grasp without suspicion. If the king favors you, why not use that to your advantage?" A slow realization dawned in Amnon's eyes. Jonadab leaned in, his voice smooth as silk. "Tell your father you are ill. Tell him your body aches, that you cannot rise from your bed, and when he asks what you need, say you want Tamar to come to you, alone, to tend to you, to care for you. A simple request. And when she arrives, well..." Amnon swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. It was so simple, and yet so dangerous. But did it matter? Did anything matter when the throne was already his? He exhaled, his decision made. "I will do it," he said. Jonadab clapped him on the shoulder. "Then you shall have what you desire, my prince." Amnon sat back, his heart pounding, his thoughts clouded with what was to come. What harm was there in taking what was already his? Amnon reclined on the cushioned bedding in his chamber, his face set in a solemn expression as he awaited the news. Jonadab's plan was in motion, and soon the king would grant his request. The sun streamed through the lattice windows, casting patterns of light across the stone floor. Outside, the palace was alive with voices, servants hurrying through the corridors, messengers carrying scrolls, the distant clang of metal from the courtyard where soldiers trained. But inside this room, a different battle was taking place. Amnon had always lived with privilege. As David's firstborn son, he had been given the finest education, the strongest tutors in combat, and the best of everything the kingdom had to offer. And yet, despite all he possessed, he felt restless. "Why is it," he murmured to himself, "that a man who has everything still desires more?" A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called. A royal servant stepped inside, bowing slightly. "My lord, the king has agreed to your request. Lady Tamar has been summoned." Amnon nodded, dismissing the servant with a flick of his hand. He had known his father would not refuse him. David loved his children and sought to grant them their desires. And now Tamar would come. She was a kind and gentle soul, a woman known for her grace and wisdom. She carried herself with the dignity of a princess, yet she treated others with humility and warmth. Amnon had observed how others admired her, how they spoke of her goodness. She was a jewel in their father's house, a light among the royal daughters. And yet, she remained distant. She was always in the presence of her handmaidens, always engaged in the duties expected of a daughter of the king. He had never been close enough to truly know her. But now, she would come to him. Amnon exhaled slowly, running a hand through his dark hair. He knew what he was doing, knew that this was a dangerous game. But his heart was set on what he had convinced himself he deserved. Footsteps sounded in the corridor. He sat up straighter. A moment later, Tamar entered, carrying a tray with flour, oil, and spices. Her presence brightened the room as if she carried sunlight with her. "Brother," she said, offering a gentle smile, "I heard you were unwell. I have come to prepare food for you, that you may regain your strength." Her voice was kind, filled with genuine concern. For a fleeting moment, something stirred in Amnon's conscience. She had come willingly, out of love for her family. She had trusted him, and trust was not something to be taken lightly. But the moment passed. Jonadab's words echoed in his mind. "You are the heir. You can have anything you desire." Amnon watched as Tamar moved about the room, preparing the food with skilled hands, humming softly as she worked. Her gentleness only strengthened his resolve. She did not know. She could not see the storm that was brewing in his heart. And soon it would be too late. Tamar worked diligently. kneading the dough with careful hands, her movements fluid and practiced. The scent of warm spices filled the chamber as she prepared the food, her focus solely on serving her brother. Amnon sat watching, his fingers drumming lightly against his knee. The flickering torchlight cast long shadows across the stone walls, and for a moment there was only silence between them. Tamar glanced up and smiled. "You will feel better after you eat, brother." Her kindness was genuine. She had come because she believed he was in need. But Amnon's heart was not stirred by gratitude. It was clouded by selfishness. As Tamar finished preparing the meal, she stepped forward, offering the food to him. But when she did, everything changed. The warmth in the room vanished. The kindness of a sister was met with something else entirely. Tamar's eyes widened, confusion flashing across her face as Amnon's demeanor shifted. The safety she had known was suddenly gone. "Brother," she began, taking a step back. But Amnon was no longer listening to reason. Her voice trembled as she tried to appeal to him, but her words fell on deaf ears. He had already decided what he would do. And in that moment, trust was shattered. When it was over, Tamar sat frozen, her hands shaking as she pulled her cloak tightly around herself. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with disbelief. "You have brought shame upon me," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "This should not have happened." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with sorrow. Amnon looked at her, but the desire that had once burned in him was gone. He had wanted, he had taken, and now all that remained was emptiness. His gaze hardened. "Leave me," he muttered, turning away. Tamar's breath caught. "What?" "I said leave," Amnon repeated, his tone sharper. He could not stand to look at her. Tamar's eyes filled with tears. "Do not cast me away like this. The wrong you have done to me is already great. Do not make it worse by sending me away." But Amnon had already called for his servants. "Remove her," he ordered coldly. Tamar gasped, her hands trembling as she tried to reason with him. She had come to him in trust, and now she was being cast aside as if she were nothing. But Amnon did not look at her again. The doors were opened, and Tamar was forced to leave. Outside the palace halls, Tamar fell to her knees, her sobs silent but deep. She took hold of the fabric of her garments and tore them in grief. She had once walked these halls with dignity, with the innocence of a royal daughter. But now, everything was different. Her voice shook as she whispered, "What will I do now?" No answer came, only silence. And as she pulled ashes over her head, mourning what had been lost, the palace continued as if nothing had happened. But something had, and judgment was coming. Tamar did not return to her chambers that day. She did not walk the palace corridors as she once had, nor did she speak to the other women of the court. Instead, she went to the house of her brother Absalom, her face streaked with silent tears, her once bright spirit dimmed beneath the weight of grief. Absalom took one look at her and knew. His sister, the one he had protected since childhood, the one whose laughter had once filled their home, was now broken. His jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He did not need to ask what had happened. "Was it Amnon?" he asked, his voice low, dangerous. Tamar nodded, her lip trembling. Absalom's breath came sharp and slow. He did not explode in rage. He did not shout or break anything. But his silence was heavier than any outburst could have been. He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Do not let this consume you, my sister," he said gently. "You will live in my house now. You will be under my protection." But beneath his calm words, a storm was brewing. Tamar remained in Absalom's house from that day forward. She no longer smiled. She no longer spoke as she once did. And Absalom, he never forgot. He waited and he watched. And in his heart, vengeance began to grow. Amnon, meanwhile, returned to his life as if nothing had changed. He walked the palace halls with the same confidence, sat at his father's table with the same ease, laughed with his brothers without a second thought. But something had changed, and though he did not realize it, he had sealed his fate the moment he cast Tamar aside. Absalom did not confront him immediately. He did not shout his anger in the throne room or demand justice from their father. Instead, he waited. For 2 years, he said nothing. He let time pass. He let Amnon believe he had escaped without consequence. But justice was patient. And when the time was right, Absalom made his move. One evening, Absalom approached his father, King David, with a request. "My lord," he said, bowing with practiced grace, "the time of shearing has come. I wish to hold a great feast in the countryside for my brothers. Let all the sons of the king be invited, that we may celebrate together." David looked at him with mild amusement. "All of them?" "Yes, my lord," Absalom said smoothly. "It is only fitting for a royal gathering." David nodded, pleased by the unity of his sons. "Very well. You may host the feast." Absalom bowed low. "Thank you, my king." He turned to leave but paused. "One more thing," he said. David raised an eyebrow. "Let Amnon be among them." The words were spoken lightly, with no trace of anger. David hesitated for a moment, then waved a hand. "As you wish." Absalom smiled. But it was not the smile of a man preparing for a feast. It was the smile of a man who had waited 2 years for this moment, and now the time for justice had come. The countryside of Ephraim stretched wide under the open sky, its rolling hills bathed in the warm light of the setting sun. The sound of music and laughter filled the air as the sons of King David gathered around the long feast table, their voices loud, their cups full. The smell of roasted lamb and spiced bread drifted through the breeze, and servants moved swiftly between the guests, pouring wine and placing fresh dishes before them. At the head of the gathering, Absalom sat, his expression calm, his demeanor light. He laughed when his brothers spoke, nodded along to their stories, and raised his cup in celebration. No one suspected. No one knew why they had truly been gathered here. And at the far end of the table, Amnon sat among them, unaware of the noose tightening around him. For 2 years, Absalom had remained silent. For 2 years, he had let Amnon believe that his crime had been forgotten. But the memory of Tamar's tears had never left him. And now, the time for waiting had passed. Amnon leaned back in his chair, lifting his goblet to his lips. The wine was strong, warming his body as he laughed along with his brothers. "A fine feast, Absalom," he said, raising his cup toward his host. "It seems your herds have been good to you this year." Absalom smiled. "Yes, brother, they have. And what is mine is yours." Amnon grinned, pleased with the hospitality. He did not see the glance Absalom gave to his servants. He did not see the slight nod, the silent command. But he did feel the sudden stillness that fell over the table. The laughter ceased, the music faltered. And before Amnon could react, the servants moved. There was a flash of metal, a sharp gasp, then a scream. Amnon clutched his chest, his goblet slipping from his hand as pain shot through his body. His vision blurred, his breath caught. He looked up, struggling to focus, only to see Absalom standing over him. His brother's expression was unreadable, not angry, not vengeful, just final. "Justice," Absalom murmured, "for Tamar." Amnon opened his mouth to speak, to plead, to demand, to curse. But no words came. The world around him darkened, and before he could understand what had truly happened, he was gone. The palace erupted into chaos. Word spread swiftly. David's son was dead. The king sat in silence when he heard the news, his face pale, his hands trembling. His firstborn, his heir, his son, gone. Absalom had fled. He had taken justice into his own hands, and now he was a fugitive, a murderer, a rebel. David tore his garments, grief overtaking him. "Oh, my son!" he wept. "Oh, Amnon!" But his cries would not bring him back. And as the weight of his household sins pressed upon him, David realized that his family, his kingdom, would never be the same. For the sword had come to his house, and it would not depart. The halls of the palace had never felt so heavy with silence. The once great home of King David, filled with music and celebration, now carried the weight of mourning and unrest. Amnon was dead. Absalom had vanished. And Tamar remained in quiet sorrow, her voice silenced by the betrayal that had shattered her world. King David sat in the chamber of his throne, his head bowed, his hands gripping the arms of his seat. His advisors stood around him, whispering among themselves, but no one dared to speak first. The grief that hung over the king was too great. Finally, Joab, the commander of David's army, stepped forward. "My lord," he said carefully, "Absalom has fled to Geshur. He remains in the house of Talmai, his grandfather." David exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening. 3 years, Joab continued. He has lived in exile. Do you wish for him to be brought back? The room tensed. For 3 years, David had warred within himself. Amnon was gone. He had suffered the punishment for his crime. And Absalom, his beloved son, his son by Maacah, his strong and ambitious child, was now a fugitive. David had lost one son to lust and recklessness. Would he lose another to vengeance and pride? He sighed, his voice quiet. "Bring him back." A murmur rippled through the room. Joab studied the king. "Do you mean to forgive him, my lord?" David's face darkened. Forgive? Could he truly forgive the son who had killed his own brother? He closed his eyes. "Bring him back to Jerusalem," he said at last, "but let him not see my face." Joab hesitated, but then nodded. "As you command, my king." The day Absalom returned to Jerusalem, the city whispered. He rode into the gates not as a fugitive, but as a prince, a son of David, still strong, still proud. But he did not go to the palace. He did not see his father. For 2 years he lived in Jerusalem, yet was kept from the king's presence. And as time passed, his resentment grew. "How long will he refuse to see me?" he asked one evening, pacing in his chamber. "Does he not know that I am his son, that I am his rightful heir?" Absalom was loved by the people. He was handsome, charismatic, powerful. The people of Israel adored him. And still, David did not call for him. "I will not be ignored," Absalom muttered. He turned to one of his men. "Go to Joab. Tell him I wish to see my father. If he refuses, burn his fields." The servant's eyes widened. "Burn Joab's fields, my lord?" "You heard me." Joab came quickly after that. "What have you done?" the commander demanded, his voice sharp. Absalom smirked. "Ah, you come now? I have been in this city for 2 years, and you ignored me. But fire? That makes you listen?" Joab exhaled through his nose, his temper barely restrained. "What do you want?" "I want what is mine," Absalom said simply. "I want to see the king. I want to be restored to my place." Joab studied him for a long moment. Then he turned and left. David sat in his chamber when Joab arrived. "Absalom demands to see you, my king," Joab said, his voice neutral. David sighed, rubbing his temples. It had been 5 years since Amnon's death. 5 years since he had looked upon the son who had avenged his sister. And now Absalom waited for his judgment. Would he restore him, or would he reject him? Finally, David nodded. "Bring him to me." When Absalom entered the throne room, his chin was high, his shoulders squared. David looked at him for the first time in 5 years. He had changed. He was no longer just a prince. He was a leader. A man with ambition burning in his eyes. A silence stretched between them. Then slowly, David stepped forward, and he embraced his son. "You are restored to me," he said quietly. Absalom closed his eyes, allowing the embrace. But as he stepped back, he looked at his father with something unreadable in his gaze. David believed that the storm had passed, that peace had been restored. But Absalom had not returned for peace. He had returned for the throne. And soon, Israel would be divided like never before. The warmth of reconciliation between David and Absalom was short-lived. Though David had welcomed his son back, the wounds in Absalom's heart had not healed. He had returned to Jerusalem not as a loyal prince, but as a man with a plan. For 2 years, he watched, he waited, and he worked in secret. Absalom knew that his father was still the king, but he also knew that the people's hearts could be swayed. And so, he began to build his own following. Each morning, Absalom would rise early and station himself by the city gate, where the people came to bring their disputes before the king's court. "What brings you here today?" he would ask the weary travelers. A farmer, holding his worn-out sandals in his hands, would sigh. "I seek justice, my lord, but who am I to stand before the king?" A widow, clutching her son's hand, would shake her head. "The palace is too far, and the judges do not hear us." And every time, Absalom would smile with the warmth of a friend. "If only I were made judge in the land," he would say with a sigh, "then every man who has a case could come to me, and I would grant him justice." And when they bowed before him, he did something no prince before him had done. He lifted them up. "No, my friend," he would say, clasping their hands. "You and I are the same. I am not above you. I am with you." And the people loved him for it. Word of Absalom's kindness spread. The people of Israel began to whisper among themselves. Absalom listens to us. Absalom cares for the people. Would he not make a great king? And so he gained their hearts, one by one. David, in his aging years, did not see the danger forming beneath his very feet. He believed that his household was restored, that his son had truly returned, but Absalom had never been content to be second. And soon he was ready to take what he believed was his. One day, Absalom came before the king. "Father," he said, "I made a vow to the Lord while I was in exile. Let me go to Hebron to fulfill it." David, seeing no harm, nodded. "Go in peace, my son." But Absalom did not go in peace. He went in power. Messengers were sent throughout Israel with a single message: when you hear the sound of the trumpet, declare, "Absalom is king in Hebron." And in a single moment, Israel was divided. Word reached David swiftly. A messenger ran through the palace halls, breathless. "My king! Absalom has declared himself ruler in Hebron. The people have turned to him." David's heart sank, not just because of the rebellion, but because it was his own son leading it. He had fought many battles in his life, but he never thought he would have to run from his own flesh and blood, and yet he had no choice. "Gather my household," he commanded. "We must leave the city before it is too late." And so, the king of Israel fled Jerusalem. He walked barefoot through the wilderness, his loyal servants following behind him, his heart heavy with sorrow. He had faced enemies before, giants, armies, kings, but this was different. This was his own son. And as he climbed the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went, he knew that the judgment upon his house had come to pass. War broke out between David's army and Absalom's forces. The land of Israel trembled as father and son stood on opposite sides of the battlefield. David did not wish to fight, but Absalom did. He rode into battle with confidence, his long hair flowing behind him, leading his men against the very kingdom that had once been his home. And then, disaster struck. As he rode beneath the thick branches of an oak tree, his hair caught in the limbs. His horse rode forward, but he did not. Suspended in the air, unable to free himself, Absalom was left hanging, helpless. And Joab, David's commander, did not hesitate. The son of David fell that day. The rebellion ended, and Israel's kingdom was restored. When David received the news, he did not rejoice. He did not celebrate the victory. Instead, he fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "Oh, my son Absalom!" he cried. My son Absalom! Would that I had died instead of you." His cries echoed through the palace halls. For though the throne was safe, his family was broken beyond repair, David continued to reign. He restored order to the kingdom, but he never forgot. The sins of his house, the violence, the betrayal, the sorrow, left scars that would never fade. And though the Lord remained faithful to him, the words of the prophet Nathan had come true. "The sword will never depart from your house." For David, the greatest battles he had ever fought were not against his enemies. They were against his own sons. The greatest battles he had ever fought were not against his enemies. They were against his own sons.